Hey there, viewers. Imagine stumbling upon a secret so dangerous that speaking up could change everything, but staying silent could mean something far worse. Would you risk it all to expose the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Yesterday, Diddy finally broke his silence on where the missing children are, and his revelation is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Vanishing of the Forgotten. They say the city has a way of swallowing people whole. The streets, once familiar, start to close in. The alleys stretch longer than they should, and before you know it, someone's gone. No trace, no goodbye, just a whisper left in their place. A story that gets passed around in hushed conversations, never loud enough for anyone to do something about it. I used to think that's just how it was. People run away, people disappear, until I started noticing the patterns. It started small, a name I had heard before, a face that felt familiar, appearing on some obscure forum post about a missing girl. The post wasn't from a concerned mother or a desperate friend. It was from someone like me, someone who sees what they're not supposed to and starts asking questions they shouldn't. She was 17, a pretty girl, bright-eyed in a way that only girls who haven't yet been broken by the world tend to be. She wanted to be a model, maybe an actress. She had posted about some exclusive party she got invited to, one of those ones that don't make it to the blogs, the ones where the guest list is handwritten and security knows every face before they even step through the door. Diddy's name came up almost instantly. The party had been his, or at least one of his. His face was all over the industry. His name tied to places where only the untouchable men walked freely. But that wasn't what made me pause. It was the pattern. She wasn't the first. A dozen names, maybe more. Girls, boys, most of them young, too young, all looking for a way in, a way up. They came from places where hope is a currency and fame is the only ticket worth playing for. But instead of making it, they just vanished. No big headlines, no outcry, just the occasional mention from a grieving parent who knew damn well their kid wouldn't have just left without a word. It was easy to ignore at first. The industry eats people alive every day. But the more I looked, the harder it became to pretend these weren't connected. Every missing name led back to the same kinds of places: private parties, backroom events, secret gatherings where the cameras didn't flash and the doors didn't open for just anyone. And over again, the same names kept showing up. Diddy was one of them. I started digging, not online, because if this was what I thought it was, the internet wasn't going to give me anything real. I went to the places where these kids had been last seen, talked to the ones who had gotten out, the ones who knew just enough to be scared. Most of them wouldn't say much. Some laughed it off, told me I was crazy. But others, they hesitated, their eyes darted around, their voices dropped. They would tell me just enough to make me feel sick. The girl, the 17-year-old, had been last seen at one of Diddy's private events. No phones were allowed inside, no cameras. That wasn't unusual, but security had been tighter than normal. Men stationed at every exit, even some outside where no one was supposed to be. Her friends were told she left, that she got too drunk and took a car home. But she never made it home. No record of an Uber, no messages sent, nothing, just gone. And that was the part that scared me the most, because disappearances leave footprints. A ping from a phone, a charge on a credit card, a last text sent to the wrong person. But this was clean, too clean. Like someone had made sure she didn't just vanish. They made sure she was erased. I started reaching out to the families. That was the hardest part. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe anger, maybe denial. What I got was silence. Hollow, tired silence from mothers and fathers who had already been beaten down. Some of them had stopped looking, not because they didn't care, but because they knew no one was listening. They had gone to the police, they had begged, pleaded, screamed for someone to take them seriously, and every time they got the same thing. Nothing. No evidence, no case, no hope. One mother told me something I'll never forget. She said, "I know she's not coming back, I just want to know where she went." Where she went. Where they all went. I kept pushing, started talking to people I shouldn't have. Not the powerful ones, the ones who worked for them, the ones who saw things but were too small to be noticed. The housekeepers, the drivers, the security guards who didn't last long on the job. And that's when I started hearing about the tunnels. It sounded ridiculous at first, like some bad internet conspiracy about underground bunkers and secret passageways beneath the mansions of the elite. But the more I heard it, the harder it became to dismiss. They weren't just tunnels, they were entire systems, hidden beneath properties, running between estates, some leading to places that weren't even on public records. Some were built decades ago, repurposed for things that no one would ever speak about. One man, executed fired after one night on the job, told me he saw something he wasn't supposed to. He didn't say much, just that he had been stationed outside a lower level of a property. No cameras, no phone signal, just a single door leading down into the dark. He had seen a van pull up, watched as something was moved inside. He never saw what it was, just that whatever it was, it didn't come back up. He left the job the next day. I asked him if it was just that house, if it was just Diddy. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "This goes way beyond him," he said, "but he's got his own. You don't get that rich without playing the game." I don't know what I expected when I started this. Maybe just another dead end, another story that led nowhere, because the ones with money always get to wash their hands clean. But this wasn't just a story. This was something else. A pattern, a system, and I was just starting to see it. Chapter 2. The Underground Network. It took weeks before I found the right person. I had followed dead ends, spoken to people who wanted nothing to do with me, and chased leads that dissolved the moment I got too close. But then, someone reached out to me. No name, no number, just a message sent from a burner account, short and to the point. "I know what you're looking for, meet me." There was no hesitation in my decision. I knew it was risky, meeting a stranger under vague circumstances while asking questions that powerful people didn't want answered was the kind of thing that got people killed. But I had gone too far to turn back. The location was a rundown diner off a deserted highway, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the coffee was always burnt. I spotted them before they spotted me. A man, mid-40s maybe, skin rough from years of sun exposure, dressed like someone who had learned long ago to blend in. The moment I sat down across from him, I could feel his eyes studying me, assessing whether I was a problem, a liability, or just another fool chasing ghosts. "You want to know about the tunnels?" His voice was quiet, but there was something behind it, something that told me he wasn't asking. He already knew why I was here. I didn't answer, I just nodded. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, fingers tapping against the cracked surface of the table. "You ever wonder why certain people never seem to get caught up in scandals?" He smirked, but there was no humor in it. Why, no matter how many people go missing around them, no one digs too deep? I had thought about it. I had seen the way things worked, the way names disappeared from headlines, the way investigations stalled before they even began. "The tunnels exist," he said, his voice lowering. "They're not some urban legend. They're real. I worked maintenance on one of them years ago. Didn't know what I was dealing with at the time, just another job." He rubbed at the side of his face, like he was remembering something he wished he hadn't. "They run deep. Some connect to states, some lead to places you wouldn't even believe exist. They were built under the guise of privacy, places to move without being seen, but they're used for something else now." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. "Like what?" He stared at me for a long time before answering. "Like moving people." The words landed like a gut punch. Their biggest asset is discretion. He continued, no cameras, no phones, no records. You think all those big Hollywood parties are just about music and drinking? No, those are for show. The real business happens underground, where no one can see, where the right people can be brought in and out without a trace. It sounded insane. Tunnels beneath estates, running like veins under the skin of the city. Secret passageways used to move people like they were cargo. I wanted to dismiss it, tell myself that it was the kind of thing only lunatics on conspiracy forums believed. But I had seen too much already, and I knew, if something sounds too crazy to be real, it's probably the truth. Who else knows about this? I asked. He laughed, shaking his head. Everyone who matters, and everyone who talks either disappears or learns real quick to keep their mouths shut. I wanted more. I needed something tangible, something I could see, a lead I could follow. He hesitated when I pressed him for specifics. Look, he finally said, voice hushed. I can't give you everything, but I can tell you this. There's a house, one of Diddy's, not the flashy ones people talk about. This one doesn't show up in the headlines. You won't find pictures of it, but it's there, and underneath it, that's where you'll find what you're looking for. I barely had time to ask him where before he was already standing up, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the table. You didn't hear any of this from me. And just like that, he was gone. I spent the next few days trying to confirm what he had told me. I searched property records, real estate transactions, anything that would tell me if this house actually existed, but there was nothing. No sale history, no documentation. It was like the house had been wiped from existence. But then I found something else. I had been looking in the wrong places. The house wasn't listed under Diddy's name, at least not directly, but it belonged to a shell company, a meaningless name that led back to his inner circle, the kind of people who owned things without ever needing to claim them. That was my first confirmation. The house was real. The second confirmation came from blueprints. They were old, buried in the archives of city planning records. The house had a basement that wasn't listed anywhere else, a lower level, the kind that only existed when people wanted to hide something. And then I got the final piece. A security contractor, someone who had worked one night only for an event that never should have happened. He didn't want to talk at first, kept telling me he had signed paperwork, that it wasn't worth the risk, but I kept pushing. Finally, he cracked. I don't know what I saw, he admitted, running a hand through his short cropped hair. It was late. My shift had just started. We weren't allowed to ask questions, just follow orders. He exhaled, shaking his head. A van pulled up, big one, blacked out windows, no plates. They had us form a perimeter, make sure no one got too close. We weren't supposed to look inside, but I did. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. There were kids in the back. My blood ran cold. How young? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. Too young. He was gripping his hands so tightly his knuckles had gone white. They didn't make a sound, didn't cry, didn't move, like they had been trained. I could barely breathe. They were taken inside, he said, through a back entrance. And then they went down. Down? He nodded, his expression dark, into the basement. Or whatever's under it. I stared at him, waiting for more, but he just rubbed his face, exhaling sharply. That was it. That was all I saw. I quit the next morning. Did you tell anyone? A bitter laugh. Who was I gonna tell? You think the cops don't know? You think the people running this don't have everybody in their pocket? He shook his head. You get too close to this and you disappear, just like those kids. I knew he was right. But that didn't stop the fire in my gut. I had my proof. Now I just had to get inside. Chapter 3. The House of No Echoes. The house sat at the end of a long, cracked road, hidden from view by a line of overgrown trees that felt like they had been planted there on purpose. It wasn't like Diddy's other properties, the sprawling mansions, the high-rise penthouses that screamed wealth and excess. This one was different, smaller, tucked away, forgettable. The kind of place that didn't make it into real estate blogs or social media posts. The kind of place that existed just outside of memory, where people drove past every day but never really saw. I had spent the last week circling the area, watching, waiting. From the outside, it looked abandoned. The driveway was cracked, the paint on the front gate chipped and peeling. No movement, no signs of life. But something wasn't right. It was too perfect in its emptiness, like it had been designed to be overlooked. I started noticing things. The way the security cameras weren't mounted high, the way they didn't follow normal angles. They weren't pointed at the house itself, but outward, as if watching for something coming in rather than anything going out. Then there were the lights, off most nights, except for random flashes from the lower level. Not the kind of flickering that comes from a loose wire or a dying bulb, but controlled bursts, like signals. The neighbors, or what few there were, knew nothing. When I asked about the house, they shrugged. Some said it had been empty for years. Some said it had been bought by a private investor, a term that meant nothing and everything at the same time. One older man, his hands rough with age, just shook his head when I pressed him for more. "You're better off forgetting about it," he muttered before shutting his door. But I couldn't, not now. During my surveillance, I noticed that security changed every 3 months, a full rotation. Always different men, never the same faces for too long. Some carried themselves like professionals, ex-military maybe, men who had spent years guarding things that weren't supposed to be seen. Others were younger, newer, less experienced. Those were the ones I watched. One of them made a mistake. A small one, but enough. A side door left unlocked for too long before he realized and shut it. That was all I needed. I waited until the shift change. When one car left, another arrived, and there was a brief 2-minute window where the property was unguarded. I moved fast, keeping low, slipping past the rusted gate and pressing myself into the shadows along the tree line. Up close, the house felt even emptier. No birds, no insects, just a stillness that pressed against my ears like something was missing. The air felt heavier, the silence unnatural. A place that had been abandoned should feel forgotten. This didn't. This felt hidden. The windows were blacked out, not just covered but sealed. No light in, no light out. Whatever was inside, no one was supposed to see. I made my way toward the side of the house, past a cluster of thorny brush that looked like it had been allowed to grow wild. My foot hit something hard beneath the dirt, a vent barely visible. Metal grates rusted at the edges. When I knelt down, pressing my ear to the opening, I heard it. A sound, faint, but there. Voices. Not words, not conversations, just noises. Movement. Someone, something breathing beneath me. I pressed a little harder, angling myself to see through the thin slats. It was dark inside, but my eyes adjusted just enough to catch the glint of metal. Not furniture, not appliances, bars. I froze. That's when I noticed the door. Half hidden beneath layers of ivy and dead branches, it blended into the side of the house almost seamlessly. A heavy iron frame, nothing like the rest of the property's flimsy wooden exterior. It didn't belong. It was meant to be concealed. I reached out, running my fingers along the seam of the door. The metal was cold, solid, locked from the inside. And then I heard it again. A shuffle, a movement, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from inside the house. Someone was there. I backed away slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The last thing I needed was to get caught. I had already stayed too long, gotten too close. I turned and made my way back toward the trees, forcing myself to keep my steps even, to not run. Running would make noise. Running would get me noticed. I slipped back through the gate just as a black SUV turned onto the road. I barely made it into the cover of the trees before it pulled up in front of the house. The doors opened, two men stepping out, both dressed in dark suits, neither of them looking like they belonged in a place like this. One of them spoke into a phone, glancing around like he was checking for something. For someone. I didn't stick around to find out. By the time I made it back to my car, I felt like I had been holding my breath for hours. I forced myself to sit still, to slow my breathing. I knew what I had seen. A door that wasn't supposed to be there, voices where there shouldn't be any, bars beneath a house that was supposed to be abandoned. There was something under that house, and I wasn't leaving without finding out what it was. Chapter 4, The Sounds Below. I didn't go back to the house right away. Not yet. I knew I was close, too close, but I needed more. More proof, more understanding of what exactly I was walking into. The house wasn't just some forgotten property. It was a veiled secret, something deliberately buried beneath layers of silence, money, and fear. The kind of secret that wasn't just ignored, but actively erased. I spent the next few weeks watching, waiting. The security rotation remained steady. New faces every few months, no overlap. No one stayed long enough to ask questions. The vehicles that came and went were always unmarked, always the same shade of black. Their windows tinted so dark they absorbed the streetlights. But it was the deliveries that unsettled me the most. They weren't like normal deliveries. No food, no furniture, nothing that would suggest someone lived there. And yet, the trucks kept coming. Always at odd hours. Always large enough to transport something. Someone. The deeper I dug, the more dead ends I hit. The paper trail was intentionally thin, riddled with false names, shell companies that led to nowhere. And every person I approached, the ones who might have known something, they all shut down the moment I brought up the house. Some pretended not to know what I was talking about. Others simply walked away without a word. Then finally I got a break. An old contact of mine, someone who used to run in certain circles before falling out of favor, reached out. No pleasantries, no explanations, just a simple, cryptic message. Meet me, but come alone. I drove to the location, a rundown gas station on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the lights flickered and the air smelled like stale fuel. My contact was already there, leaning against his car, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't look at me right away, just exhaled smoke and muttered, "You don't stop, do you?" I didn't answer. He shook his head, finally turning to face me. "You're asking the kind of questions that don't get answered," he said. "Not unless you're willing to trade something." I could tell he wasn't just talking about money. "You used to work for him," I said. "For Diddy." His expression hardened. "A long time ago. But you saw things." Silence, then a slow nod. I could feel the weight of his hesitation, the way his fingers twitched slightly before he flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. He was scared, and if he was scared, then I knew I was on the right path. "He knows about the tunnels," he finally said. "Of course he does. He used them. Still does." My pulse quickened. "For what?" Another long pause. "Everything," he said flatly. "People, drugs, things you wouldn't believe. The tunnels run deeper than anyone thinks. Some connect estates, some lead to places no one even knows exist. And he's not the only one using them." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Who else?" He gave a humorless laugh. "You think a man like that operates alone?" He shook his head. "Celebrities, executives, politicians, even people from outside the country. The kind of men who don't leave paper trails because they don't have to." I could feel him shutting down, his patience running thin. He had already told me more than he should have. I pushed anyway. "What about the kids?" The reaction was instant. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened. He took a step back, his gaze shifting, as if checking for something unseen. "I can't talk about that. You already are." His eyes snapped to mine, dark and unreadable. "Drop it," he said, voice low. "Whatever you think you're doing, whoever you think you're trying to help, it won't matter. Because if you keep going, you'll end up just like them." He turned to leave. I grabbed his arm. "Tell me where they are." He yanked free, face pale now. "You don't want to know." "I do." For a moment, I thought he was going to drive away, but then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, "If you ever get inside, don't listen too closely. The sounds will stay with you." And then he was gone. The words stuck with me, crawled under my skin and stayed there. That night, I went back to the house. I didn't try to get in, not yet. I just stood at a distance, far enough to be hidden but close enough to hear. The wind had died down. The streets were silent, and for the first time, without the hum of passing cars or the distant chatter of city life, I heard it. Faint, distant, but undeniably human. A sound I couldn't quite place. Not crying, not talking, just something. The sound of something breathing where nothing should be. Something is down there. And now I have to find out what. Chapter 5, The Revelation. The message came in the middle of the night. No name, no number, just a single line stark against the darkness of my screen. Tomorrow, 2 a.m. Warehouse District. Come alone. That was it. No explanation, no threats, no promises of answers. Just a command dropped into my lap like a loaded gun. I stared at the words for a long time, fingers hovering over the screen. My heart was hammering, every nerve on edge. By now I had learned how this worked. This was not an invitation, it was an order. Whoever sent this knew I was looking, knew I had gotten too close. And yet, despite every instinct telling me to walk away, to pretend I had never seen it, I knew I wouldn't. I barely slept that night. My mind was a battlefield, running through every possibility, every angle, every way this could go wrong. The silence of my apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing in on me from all sides. I thought about what I had already uncovered: the tunnels, the house, the sounds beneath the earth, the children, the things I wasn't supposed to know. By the time the clock hit 1 a.m., I was already dressed and out the door. The drive to the warehouse district felt longer than usual, though I barely remembered the turns I took. The city had a different face at night, stretched thin and hollow. Streetlights flickered in and out like dying stars, and the roads seemed endless, looping back on themselves. The farther I drove, the emptier everything became. By the time I pulled up to the meeting point, there wasn't a single soul in sight. The warehouse was massive, its rusting skeleton silhouetted against the distant glow of the city. It looked abandoned, forgotten, one of the countless structures left to rot on the outskirts of civilization. A single bulb flickered above the entrance, casting jagged shadows across the concrete. I hesitated, scanning the lot, searching for movement. Nothing. No cars, no guards. Just the wind, whispering through hollow steel beams. I gritted my teeth and stepped forward. The metal door was slightly ajar, yawning open just wide enough for me to slip inside. The moment I did, the night swallowed me whole. The air inside was thick, heavy with dust and the scent of old oil. It was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that didn't belong in a place like this. I moved cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound against the concrete floor. The warehouse was gutted, empty except for a single object placed deliberately in the center of the room. A chair, and on it a phone. It was old, battered, the kind of burner device you'd pick up in a gas station for cash. The screen was already lit when I picked it up. A single file waiting for me. A video. I hesitated, fingers tightening around the device. My pulse thundered in my ears. Whoever had left this wanted me to see it. I pressed play. For the first few seconds, the screen was nothing but darkness. A faint hum buzzed through the speakers, low, distant, mechanical. Then, a flicker. Grainy footage filmed by someone moving in secret. The camera jostled slightly, the angle unsteady. Then, the tunnel came into view. The walls were old, lined with crumbling brick. Water dripped from pipes overhead, the sound echoing through the narrow corridor. The lighting was dim, flickering weakly against the damp floor. Then, movement. A figure stepped into frame. I felt my stomach drop. Diddy. There was no mistaking him. He wasn't posing for cameras, wasn't putting on a performance. He was just there, standing in the middle of a space that shouldn't have existed. And he wasn't alone. The footage panned slightly, revealing more figures, some partially obscured, others standing just out of reach of the dim light. Their faces were blurred, deliberate or accidental, I couldn't tell. They moved with purpose, speaking in hushed voices. But it wasn't them that held my focus. It was the children. At first, I didn't see them. They weren't in the foreground, weren't the focus of the shot. But there, in the background, standing near the tunnel walls, they were there. Not many, but enough. They didn't fidget, didn't shift or whisper. They just stood there, still as statues, blank-faced and unreadable. They didn't look scared. They didn't look... anything. Something was wrong. Deeply, horribly wrong. Their eyes were vacant, their postures unnervingly rigid. They weren't being held by force. They weren't restrained, and yet it was clear they weren't leaving either. Like they had nowhere to go. Like they didn't even know they could go. The footage shifted, the camera moving slightly closer. That's when I heard it. The first words spoken. Diddy's voice was low, barely above a whisper. The microphone struggled to pick up the sound, but I turned the volume up, straining to catch every word. "Done here. Too much attention. We move them soon." A second voice responded. I couldn't make it out at first. It was deeper, rougher, but the meaning was clear. "Where?" Diddy hesitated. "New location, out of the country." My breath caught in my throat. The camera jolted. Whoever was filming flinched, and then the sound of footsteps. Fast, approaching. The screen scrambled, static overtaking the frame, and then blackness. The video ended. I stood there, the phone trembling in my grip. My mind felt scrambled, my thoughts sluggish, like my brain refused to process what I had just seen. I played it again, and again. Each time, the horror settled deeper into my bones. The tunnels were real. The children were real. And they were about to be moved. I clenched my jaw, every muscle in my body locking up. This wasn't just some forgotten piece of a puzzle anymore. This wasn't just an investigation. This was happening now. Diddy was covering his tracks. He was clearing out. The tunnels weren't safe anymore. He was pulling them, whoever they were, however many there were, out of sight, out of reach. And if I didn't act now, I'd never find them again. The window was closing, and I had no idea how much time I had left. Chapter 6, Beneath the Surface. There was no room for hesitation anymore, no second guessing, no turning back. The moment I saw that video, I knew I was past the point of safety. The children were real, the tunnels were real, and in less than a week they'd be gone, disappeared, erased. I barely slept the next 48 hours. My brain was running in loops, dissecting every possible angle, every potential failure. I wasn't just dealing with a man like Diddy, I was dealing with an entire system designed to keep people like me out. The tunnels beneath his estate weren't just a personal secret, they were a network, part of something far bigger than one celebrity. If I got caught, I wouldn't be arrested, but I wouldn't even be found. But I wasn't alone anymore. There were others. People who knew something was wrong. Survivors, ex-security, even one or two industry workers who had overheard the wrong conversations and decided to run. Some had been looking for answers longer than I had. Some had lost people, sisters, brothers, children. Others had simply witnessed enough to know that the stories weren't just stories. We met in the back of an abandoned auto shop, an hour outside the city. 5 of us. No names, no unnecessary details. The less we knew about each other, the safer we were. The plan was simple. We had to get inside the tunnels. Find proof. Find them. The information I had gathered over the past few weeks was enough to give us a way in. The estate wasn't like Diddy's other properties. There were no massive parties, no sprawling security details. It was hidden, discreet, but not empty. Security rotated every few months. Deliveries came in, but nothing ever left. One of the others had managed to get blueprints of the original structure. Not easy to find, considering the house technically didn't exist, but before it had been acquired, before it had been wiped from records, the property had belonged to a foreign investor, and that version of the house had a basement. A sealed lower level. That was our way in. We waited until just past midnight. The estate was dark, silent except for the occasional movement of security. It took exactly 4 minutes for us to reach the outer perimeter. We stayed low, moving along the tree line. No cameras outside, just guards. Diddy didn't rely on technology to protect this place. He relied on people, and people made mistakes. The back of the property had an old storage shed. It was built against the sloping hill of the land, mostly hidden by overgrown brush. It didn't look like much, just rusted walls, a padlocked door. But beneath it, the entrance. The padlock was old, barely secured. One of the others, a former security contractor, had it open in less than a minute. Inside, the shed smelled like mildew and rotting wood, dust thick in the air. I scanned the floor, running my hand along the dirt until I felt it. A metal handle, half buried beneath debris. I pulled. The hatch groaned open. Beneath it, a stairway, the entrance to the tunnels. We moved fast. The air grew colder with every step, thick with dampness. The deeper we went, the more the scent changed. Earthy at first, then sterile, chemically treated. A place not meant to be seen, but maintained all the same. The first corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people. The walls were stone, old and uneven, lined with pipes that dripped water onto the floor. It was clear this wasn't a new structure. It had existed long before Diddy ever touched it. But it had been repurposed, reinforced in places, leading somewhere deeper. We moved carefully, keeping close to the walls. Every few feet we found marks, scratches in the stone, deep enough to be deliberate. Someone had tried to escape. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to keep going. Then, ahead of us, the tunnel split. 2 paths, one leading further into the dark, the other toward a door. It was metal, out of place against the stone, with a small red light flickering beside it. A security system, still active. We listened. Nothing. I reached out and pressed against the surface. The cold bit into my skin, but after a moment, it moved. The room beyond was small, too clean. The others filed in behind me, their breathing sharp with tension. The air inside was different, stale and manufactured, like a space meant to be sterile. A metal table stood in the center, covered in papers. I stepped closer, scanning the documents, names. Some were crossed out, others marked with dates. But the ages, 9, 10, 7. My fingers clenched around the paper. Then I saw the pile in the corner. Discarded belongings. A pair of small shoes, a stuffed animal, a bracelet too small for an adult wrist. A cold realization settled over me. They weren't just taking them, they were keeping records. One of the others muttered something under their breath. I turned. They weren't looking at the documents. They were looking at another door. It was barely visible at first, blending into the farthest wall, but unlike the first, this one wasn't locked. It was slightly open. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. The floor beyond the doorway was different. Dirt, not stone. Then, in the dim light, I saw a shape. I froze. Something was half buried in the ground, a body, or what was left of one. I forced myself closer, every muscle screaming at me to turn back. The corpse was long decayed, the clothes barely holding together. Whoever they were, they had been here for a long time, and they had died trying to get out. The others went silent. No one moved. Then, a sound, not from the room, from the tunnels. I turned sharply, breath catching in my throat. It was faint, but growing louder. Footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. Someone knew we were here, and we had just run out of time. Chapter 7. The Escape. The footsteps were getting closer. Steady, deliberate. Not rushed, not uncertain. Whoever was coming wasn't looking for something. They already knew we were here. I turned sharply, eyes flicking between the others. The silence between us was thick, stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. No one spoke. No one had to. We all knew the truth. The tunnels weren't just pathways. They were designed for control. They weren't built to let people pass through freely. They were built to trap. We moved fast. The air in the tunnels felt heavier, thick with something unseen pressing down on us as we ran. The walls seemed to narrow, closing in with every step. It was disorienting, like the space itself was shifting around us. I gritted my teeth, forcing my legs to move faster. Behind me, the sound of pursuit was growing. Not just footsteps. Breathing. Low, measured breaths, steady as a metronome. Close. Too close. I stole a glance over my shoulder and felt my stomach twist. A shadow. Not far, not running, just walking. Like it already knew we wouldn't make it. A cold dread shot through me, but I forced it down. There was still a way out. There had to be. The tunnels stretched ahead, splitting into paths I didn't recognize. We had mapped the way in, but now, in the chaos, the layout felt different. The markings we had left on the walls, the subtle indicators to retrace our steps, gone. Someone had wiped them away. The others were looking at me now, waiting for direction. I didn't have time to hesitate. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I thought back to the blueprints, to the way the tunnels had been structured. There was a secondary exit, a maintenance hatch. It had been marked as sealed on the documents we found, but old structures always had weaknesses. I pointed left. This way. We moved as fast as we could, but the deeper we went, the more the walls seemed to close in. The air turned stale, unnatural, as if something down here was alive, watching. I kept expecting to feel hands grab at me from the darkness, kept expecting to hear voices whispering just behind my ear. But there was nothing. Nothing but the feeling that we weren't alone. Then, ahead, a door. Not locked, not barred. Open. Too open. A trap. I knew it the moment I saw it, but there was no time. The footsteps behind us had stopped. Whoever had been following us wasn't chasing anymore. They were waiting. I hesitated for half a second before stepping inside. The room was small, cluttered with old equipment, metal cabinets, a rusted medical table, boxes filled with documents. The others filed in behind me, breaths ragged. Then the door slammed shut. We spun, lunging for it, but it was too late. Locked, no handle on the inside. I cursed under my breath, scanning the room for another way out. The space was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, its weak light casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. Then I noticed something else. A mirror positioned across the far wall. No, not a mirror, a window. One-way glass. Someone was watching us. The others saw it too. No one spoke. The tension in the room felt suffocating. Then, a sound. Not from the tunnels, from inside the room. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but as I turned, my stomach twisted into knots. A speaker, embedded in the ceiling. The static crackled, filling the space like a swarm of insects crawling into my ears. Then, a voice, distorted, slow, familiar. "You should have stayed out of this." The breath stalled in my throat. Diddy? It was him, not recorded, live. He knew. A low chuckle crackled through the speaker, echoing off the walls. "You don't even know what you're playing with." One of the others slammed their fist against the glass. No reaction. "You wanted the truth?" The voice hummed, almost amused. "You got this far, so go ahead. Look around. You earned it." The light above flickered, and then the walls came alive. Screens hidden within the paneling flashed to life. At first, it was just static, then footage, surveillance. The tunnels, the rooms, the children. Not just from now, from years ago. Different faces, different times, but all the same blank expressions, the same dead stares, the same quiet obedience. And Diddy in the background, always there. I felt something inside me snap. The others were already moving, tearing through the room, searching for anything, a key, a weapon, a weakness. Then one of them shouted, "Here!" A vent, small but big enough. We didn't hesitate. One by one, we crawled through, forcing our bodies through the tight metal passage. The air inside was suffocating, thick with dust and heat. My arms ached, my lungs burned, but I kept going. Had to keep going. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed behind us. They were opening the door. We pushed forward, faster. The vent twisted, angling upward, leading to light. I reached the end first, slamming against the grate. It gave way, spilling me onto solid ground. The others followed, gasping for air. I looked up, heart hammering. We were outside? The estate loomed behind us, dark and silent. No alarms, no sirens. Like nothing had happened at all. I turned back to the others, my breath heavy. We made it. But I knew, deep in my bones, this wasn't over. Then my phone buzzed. A message. No name, no number. Just a single line. "Leave it alone." A warning. A threat. But it didn't matter. Because now I had the proof. And they knew it. Chapter 8. The last word. I disappeared before they could make me disappear. The second we made it out of that tunnel, I knew I wasn't safe. None of us were. This wasn't just a crime we had uncovered. It was an entire system. Something that had been in place for decades. Something that operated in the shadows of the industry, with a level of control that no outsider could comprehend. And we had broken in. We had seen. That alone meant we weren't walking away from this. I left everything behind. The phone, my car, every piece of myself that could be tracked, traced, or connected back to me. There was a plan for something like this, something I had prepared long before I knew how deep this went. The others had their own ways of disappearing. We didn't say goodbye, there was no point. I drove for hours, then ditched the car, found another, then another, cash only, no digital footprints. I moved from city to city, never staying in one place long enough to be noticed. I stayed in motels with no cameras, in towns that didn't ask questions. But it didn't matter, because they were looking for me. I felt it everywhere I went, a car that stayed behind me for too many miles, a door that seemed slightly ajar when I knew I had locked it, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the back of my skull in every darkened parking lot. They wouldn't come at me publicly. They wouldn't arrest me. That would be too loud, too obvious. That's not how this worked. I would simply disappear. Just like them. Just like the ones before me. It's why I had to move fast. I wasn't stupid enough to think I could expose this by myself. That's not how information like this survived. That's not how it became unstoppable. I sent it to 5 people. No names, no explanations, just the files scrambled through encrypted drives, each message buried under layers of misdirection. Some of them had been looking for this for years. Others didn't even know what they had been waiting for. The files spoke for themselves. The tunnels, the lists, the faces of those children, the footage of Diddy standing beneath the city, preparing to move them. Everything. I never heard back from them. That was the deal. Once it was out, it was out. If I was gone tomorrow, it wouldn't matter. Because the truth was no longer mine to control. But even as I was running, even as I was doing everything right, the world kept moving. And that's when it happened. Diddy vanished. Not arrested, not exposed, just gone. At first, the rumors said he had gone into hiding, that he was laying low until it all blew over. But that didn't track. Men like him, they don't hide. They get protected. And then the stories started shifting. His people were disappearing too. The security, the handlers, the executives who had been closest to him. Some walked away, distancing themselves before the cracks in the foundation became too wide to escape. Others, they were just gone. No resignations, no transfers, just... And then, the tunnels. Some were destroyed overnight, collapsed in on themselves with no official explanation. Others, sealed, not sold, not repurposed, just abandoned. And the properties? Ownership transferred to faceless corporations, buried under layers of legal roadblocks. Any trace of what had once existed beneath them, gone. Someone was cleaning up. I had seen it before, but not this fast. This wasn't panic. This was calculated, planned. Like they had been prepared for exposure. Like they had a protocol for when someone got too close. And that's when the worst part hit me. The children. Not the ones we had seen. Not the ones from the footage. The others. The ones we never found. They were gone. No trace, no records, no digital footprint at all. They hadn't been rescued. They hadn't been recovered. They had been moved. Somewhere else. Somewhere even deeper. I spent weeks trying to track something, anything that could tell me where they went. I reached out to the people who had once been willing to whisper secrets to me, but now no one would talk. Not because they didn't know, because they were afraid. Some of them went off the grid completely. Others told me to never contact them again. One of them, he was found dead. A suicide. Nothing about it was clean. Nothing about it made sense. But I didn't need to see the report to know what it was. It was a warning, and I got mine soon after. The message came in the middle of the night. No name, no number, just a single line. Leave it alone. That's when I knew. It didn't matter how much proof I had. It didn't matter how many people I sent it to. This wasn't just about one man. It wasn't just about Diddy. It was bigger than him. Bigger than all of them. This was a machine. One that had been operating for years, maybe decades, protected by power that reached into places I would never see. And now that I had seen it, now that I had glimpsed even the smallest part of what lay beneath, I was nothing more than a loose thread. But here's the thing about loose threads. If you pull hard enough, the whole thing unravels. And I wasn't the only one pulling. I wasn't the only one left. I don't know if I'll make it to the end of this. I don't know if they'll find me. if I'll be the next suicide, the next person who simply disappears in the middle of the night. But I do know this, the truth is out. And the real horror? They're still out there. The children are still missing. And no one knows where they went.